Hey, everybody, it is Monica Perez, and I am back with the second installment of our reading and discussion. Just a little peanut gallery type side comments um, of the book, The Octopus, Secret Government, and the Death of Danny Casolaro. This is a revised edition that I'm reading. It's by Kenn Thomas and Jim Keith, real classic conspiracy researchers. Jim Keith is really he died in 1999, and so that was before 9/11. He was like an OG of conspiracy researchers. I feel like before it was totally infiltrated by feds. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but I haven't read anything of his that I haven't really liked. And there's another one called he does on mind control. Boy, is that great. I'll read that one into the record too if I when I'm finished with this. But I wanted to tell you the last time when I did part 1, which if you haven't heard it, it's in my podcasting feed, The Monica Perez Show, on June 20th, 2024, if you want to listen to that one first. But at that time I mentioned that this book was like $69 at A Books, same thing for Amazon, this copy of this book. And I took a screenshot of it, or I shared my screen so you could see it on YouTube and Rumble, Rockfin, X. It was maybe even on Instagram. And I predicted that the price would go up. And I am going to show you how much it costs now. I have 2 different screenshots here. This one is a different copy of the book, The Octopus, Secret Government, and the Death of Danny Casolaro. That's one version. This version right here, $491. It was $699 when I did this. $69 when I did this on June 20th. Then there's more copies of the other one. One of them is $1,000. I saw a copy of this exact one for $950 the other day, but it's gone now. I don't know what happened to it, but it is gone. So I'm telling you, you mentioned these things once, and whatever algorithm is out there to take them off the market, there you go. So anyway, I hope I never wrote in this one. It's worth $1,000. Anyway, okay. So on with the show. Stop that screen share. All right. So we're up to chapter 4, and it's got a funny title in quotes. Danger Man. So here is the picture. If you're listening, it doesn't matter at all. It's just a picture of a U.S. Justice Department agent, Peter Videnix. That's the guy's name he features in this. All right, chapter 4, Danger Man. Bill Hamilton convinced Michael Riconosciuto to tell his story on the record. On March 21st, 1991. So if you've heard this, if you didn't hear the first one, of course you have, but if you want a refresher, Bill Hamilton is the guy who built the software for Inslaw and created the company and was suing the government for stealing it from him. It was supposed to be a way for prosecutors in different districts across the country to make sure that they knew the backstory on their different perpetrators, but it ended up being co-opted by the government for other purposes. And Bill Hamilton didn't want to let it go because they intentionally tried to bankrupt him. So Bill Hamilton convinced Michael Riconosciuto, who was somebody who was instrumental in modifying the Inslaw software for the government's nefarious purposes, but he turned whistleblower, more or less. He just basically wanted to talk about it. He said he had dirt on people, which is why he wasn't going to get killed. Anyway, Bill Hamilton convinced Michael Riconosciuto to tell his story on the record. On March 21st, 1991, Michael Riconosciuto filed a sworn affidavit on the Inslaw case. He began by stating that U.S. Justice Department agent Peter Videnix had threatened him if he cooperated with the House Judiciary Committee investigation of Inslaw. The following text of the affidavit provides a toehold for Danny Casolaro's research. Of course, this whole book is about the unexplained murder of Danny Casolaro, which was called a suicide, but because of the way both of his wrists had the tendons cut all the way through, it was physically impossible for it to be a suicide. Okay, here's the affidavit. I, Michael J. Riconosciuto, being duly sworn, do hereby state as follows. 1. During the early 1980s, I served as the director of research for a joint venture between the Wackenhut Corporation of Coral Gables, Florida, and the Cabazon Band of Indians in Indio, California. The joint venture was located on the Cabazon Reservation. 2. The Wackenhut Cabazon joint venture sought to develop and/or manufacture certain materials that are used in military and national security operations, including night vision goggles, machine guns, fuel air explosives, and biological and chemical warfare weapons. I'm not going to read you the numbers of the paragraphs, although it is helpful when you're trying to use it as a reference. As a matter of fact, on one of my newsreels recently, there was a president of Honduras who, I believe it was Honduras, who was going to jail in the US for drug running, which he said he was cooperating with the CIA under certain circumstances, whatever. He said he was railroaded. They put up witnesses and everything. And I referred to this chapter 4, this affidavit by paragraph 11, as supporting exactly what the Honduran guy was saying. So that was an interesting show. You can even look up the case, but I'm not going to read the paragraph numbers anymore. The Cabazon Band of Indians are a sovereign nation. The sovereign immunity that is accorded the Cabazons as a consequence of this fact made it feasible to pursue on the reservation the development and or manufacture of materials whose development or manufacture would be subject to stringent controls off the reservation. This is the same principle as the casinos, but it's before the casinos started cropping up on Indian reservations. As a minority group, the Cabazon Indians also provided the Wackenhut Corporation with an enhanced ability to obtain federal contracts through the 8A set-aside program. I mean, that is like a double whammy. And in connection with government-owned contractor-operated, which are called GOCO facilities. The Wackenhut Cabazon joint venture was intended to support the needs of a number of foreign governments and forces, including forces and governments in Central America and the Middle East. The Contras in Nicaragua represented one of the most important priorities for the joint venture. So remember, he's talking about this in 1991 because all this stuff was happening in the 80s. The Reagan thing, remember Iran-Contra, the Nicaraguan Contras? The Wackenhut Cabazon joint venture maintained close liaison with certain elements of the United States government, including representatives of intelligence, military, and law enforcement agencies. Among the frequent visitors to the Wackenhut Cabazon joint venture were Peter Videnix of the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., and a close associate of Videnix by the name of Earl Bryan. Bryan is a private businessman who lives in Maryland and who has maintained close business ties with the U.S. intelligence community for many years. In connection with my work for Wackenhut, I engaged in some software development and modification work in 1983 and 1984 on the proprietary Promise computer software product. That's PROMIS. Let's see if I have. There's a book here that really, really goes into it a lot. I've got Robert Maxwell, Israel's Super Spy, The Life and Murder of a Media Mogul. The San Francisco Chronicle says, Thomas and Dillon have done an impeccable job in researching and writing this fascinating book, which takes the reader deep into the intricate and dangerous world of international espionage. When I spoke to Christian Hansen, who did the Netflix documentary, he said this was not a reliable source, but I haven't revisited it since he said that. But just for the record, you can make your own judgment. That's by Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon, but it goes into a lot of this Promise stuff. The copy of Promise on which I worked, this is Michael Riconosciuto, came from the U.S. Department of Justice. Earl Bryan made it available to me through Wackenhut after acquiring it from Peter Videnix, who was then a Department of Justice contracting official with responsibility for the Promise software. I performed the modifications to Promise in Indio, California, Silver Springs, Maryland, and Miami, Florida. The purpose of the Promise software modifications that I made in 1983 and 1984 was to support a plan for the implementation of Promise in law enforcement and intelligence agencies worldwide, which was not why Bill Hamilton built it. Earl Bryan was spearheading the plan for this worldwide use of the Promise computer software. He wanted to own it, him and his buddies, and because he knew it was going to be worth billions. That's why they didn't want to pay Inslaw. They wanted to steal it and get him bankrupt. They could have just given him the $10 million they owed him, but that probably, I mean, I'm just speculating, would have acknowledged that it was his. And they didn't want that. They wanted to not only use it in nefarious ways, but profit from it. It's really a lesson in how government corruption works. Some of the modifications that I made were specifically designed to facilitate the implementation of Promise within two agencies of the Government of Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, and the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, CSIS. Earl Bryan would check with me from time to time to make certain that the work would be completed in time to satisfy the schedule for the RCMP and the CSIS implementation of Promise. The proprietary version of Promise, as modified by me, was in fact implemented in both the RCMP and the CSIS in Canada. It was my understanding that Earl Bryan had sold this version of Promise to the government of Canada, and I believe that there is evidence that it was being used there. That fact has been independently corroborated. In February 1991, I had a telephone conversation with Peter Videnix, then still employed by the U.S. Department of Justice. Videnix attempted during this telephone conversation to persuade me not to cooperate with an independent investigation of the government's piracy of Inslaw's proprietary Promise software being conducted by the Committee on the Judiciary of the House of Representatives. Now, he's working for the Department of Justice, and he's strong-arming this guy not to cooperate with a House committee. Videnix stated that I would be rewarded for a decision not to cooperate with the House Judiciary Committee investigation. Videnix forecasted an immediate and favorable resolution of a protracted child custody dispute being prosecuted against my wife by her former husband if I were to decide not to cooperate with the House Judiciary Committee investigation. Videnix also outlined specific punishments that I could expect to receive from the U.S. Department of Justice if I cooperated with the House committee. One punishment that Videnix outlined was the future inclusion of me and my father in a criminal prosecution of certain business associates of mine in Orange County, California, in connection with the operation of a savings and loan institution in Orange County. By way of underscoring his power to influence such decisions at the U.S. Department of Justice, Videnix informed me of the indictment of these business associates prior to the time when that indictment was unsealed and made public. Another punishment that Videnix threatened against me if I cooperated with the House Judiciary Committee is prosecution by the U.S. Department of Justice for perjury. This reminds me of the Franklin scandal, where the people who came out against the systemic child abuse and possibly murder were charged and I think convicted of perjury. Videnix warned me that credible witnesses would come forward to contradict any damaging claims that I made in testimony before the House Judiciary Committee, and that I would subsequently be prosecuted for perjury by the U.S. Department of Justice for my testimony before the House Judiciary Committee. That's the end of the affidavit, or as it says here, further, affiant saith not. Michael Riconosciuto, signed and sworn 21st of March, 1991. Chapter 5, Earl Bryan. Following the lead of Riconosciuto's revelations, Danny Casolaro took a long... Take my banner down. Danny Casolaro took a long look at a man named Dr. Earl Bryan. Riconosciuto claimed that this man, along with Peter Videnix, had headed the alleged Wackenhut Cabazon project to alter the Promise software. Casolaro eventually developed a dossier on Bryan. Bryan was a high-profile individual who had been a combat physician during the Vietnam War. He reportedly worked in an air support unit for the Operation Phoenix political assassination program. I think the Phoenix was more than just political assassinations. I think that's where they terrorized the population, and I think they used some of those tactics here and now. That was a well-known covert action program to wipe out the Viet Cong in Vietnam. After his return to the States, Bryan became Secretary of Health and Welfare in California under Governor Ronald Reagan. This is me talking. I liked Ronald Reagan. I really liked him. He was very charming, and I liked what he had to say, and I thought his economics made sense, and his foreign policy of a big stick made sense. When you go back and you look like how much debt he incurred, and that was probably the driver of the economics and all of this dirty business behind the scenes. I just, on the one hand, maybe he just turned a blind eye. Maybe he didn't know, but they tried to assassinate him immediately. Immediately. I mean, what do you think happens after you're surrounded by people who are supposed to be your bodyguards, but are cooperating with those who would kill you if you get out of line? So, when you take a bullet, I got to feel like, what are you going to do? I forgive people who capitulate in the media. Like, I think of some of the comedians and stuff who, they resisted at first. And then what are you going to do? You're not going to change the world. You leave a couple of jokes out of your, I don't know. I won't get into that. I have specific examples I'm happy to discuss, but I won't get into that. Okay. In 1974, Bryan had resigned his cabinet position to go into private business, which Casolaro learned had allegedly included arms deals with the Shah of Iran. Bryan's company, Zonix, had been cited by the Security and Exchange Commission for illegal commissions and for issuing press releases with bogus information meant to boost stock prices. Bryan also was involved in a scandal involving the confiscation of computer tapes with the records of 70,000 California state welfare files. These tapes were later discovered at the University of Southern California. After an unsuccessful campaign for a Senate seat, Bryan joined the USC faculty. What was that? There was a scandal, the confiscation of computer tapes with the records of 70,000 California state welfare files. I don't know what the scandal was, but anyway, during the Reagan administration, Bryan served as an unpaid chairman of a Reagan task force on healthcare cost reduction, reporting directly to Attorney General Ed Meese, who has featured already in this as being a shady guy. Bryan also served with Meese on a pro-competition committee. Further associations of Bryan and Ed Meese had come out during Meese's confirmation hearings when Meese had admitted that his wife had borrowed $15,000 from an advisor, Edwin Thomas, to buy stock in Bryan's company. Meese had not listed the transaction as financial disclosures. Bryan headed Info Technology, Inc., a powerful New York holding company which controlled UPI. That's a press thing. It's like an Associated Press. What do you call that? The financial news networks and the Learning Channel. If these connections led far afield from Inslaw, others dovetailed neatly. Hadron, Inc. was also controlled by Bryan. Hadron had suddenly taken an affluent turn after being $12 million in the red upon Meese's ascendancy to the office of Attorney General. So it was in the red, and then all of a sudden started making money when Meese took office. This is Bryan's company. The company now subsisted on government revenues, including a $40 million contract with the U.S. Department of Justice. Shaking my head. The name Hadron rang a bell with Bill Hamilton. Hamilton eventually realized that Inslaw's difficulties may have begun as early as April 1983. Hamilton had been in his office when he received a telephone call from Dominic Leite, the chairman of Hadron. Hamilton recalled Leite telling him that Hadron was trying to corner the market on law enforcement software and that they had purchased SimCon, a manufacturer of police department software, and Acumetics, a company that provides computer-based litigation support services for courts. Now, Leite was offering to buy Inslaw from Hamilton in order for Hadron to obtain the promised software. According to Hamilton, when he turned down the alleged offer, Leite bragged of his powerful contacts in the Reagan administration and told him, "We have ways of making you sell." Within 90 days of the date of the alleged Leite call, the deal between Inslaw and the Justice Department began to unravel. A little research also showed that Peter Vidanix, prior to overseeing the promised contract for the Justice Department in 1981, had been in charge of 3 contracts between the U.S. Customs Service and Hadron, Inc. In light of the links between Earl Bryan, Peter Videnix, and Hadron, suddenly Dominic Leahy's ways of making you sell threat took on more substance. Many of Riconosciuto's claims about Bryan were backed up by information in the following March 21st, 1991 affidavit filed on behalf of Inslaw by Ari Ben-Menashe. Okay. I don't know anything about this guy, except for what I, in this book, it mentioned that he was an arms dealer, I guess. Well, I'm sure we'll figure out that in a second. That he wrote a book, which, let's see how much it costs now. Profits of War Inside the Secret U.S.-Israeli Arms Network by Ari Ben-Menashe. Let's see how much that's worth. Shall we? Hold on. Sorry, I guess I should have had this ready, but I'll do it quickly. I bet I can. I just bought it. I should know. All right, now we're talking. Okay. There you go. It's $36 right now. $36, $45. Okay. So that is something that you could afford. I'll look through it, tell you if it's worthwhile, but next time we get together, let's see how much that book is worth. All right. Here is his affidavit. Ari Ben-Menashe, being duly sworn, do hereby state as follows. Between August 1977 and September 1987, I was employed by the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, Military Intelligence External Relations Department. In my above capacity, I had contacts with the Office of the Israeli Prime Minister's Anti-Terrorism Advisor. In 1982, the Israeli Prime Minister's Anti-Terrorism Advisor was Raphael Eitan. In a meeting that took place in December 1982 in Mr. Eitan's office in the Kiryat in Tel Aviv, Israel, Mr. Eitan told me that he had received earlier that year in the United States from Mr. Earl Bryan and Mr. Robert McFarlane promised computer software for the limited use of the IDF's Signals Intelligence Unit for intelligence purposes only. Mr. Eitan stated on this occasion and on earlier occasions as well that he had special relationships with both Mr. Bryan and Mr. McFarlane. Those are pictures of Earl Bryan and Ari Ben-Menashe. Not very interesting. This meeting took place in the context of a visit by a foreign dignitary. During a break in the meeting, Mr. Eitan took me aside and gave me the above facts to relate to my superiors so that Mr. Eitan's office could take credit for the introduction of the promised computer software into IDF's Signals Intelligence Unit. I hereby certify that the facts set forth in this affidavit are true and correct to the best of my knowledge. Further affiant saith not. Ari Ben-Menashe, signed and sworn, 21st of March, 1991. Okay. Lexington, Kentucky was the temporary home of Ari Ben-Menashe, a former Israeli intelligence officer who had moved there after his acquittal in New York on arms trading charges. The federal government had accused Ben-Menashe of conspiring to sell 3 transport planes to an undercover federal agent. He spent a year in prison awaiting trial, but when he finally came to trial, the jury acquitted him after he brandished a diplomatic passport as evidence that his activities had been sanctioned by Israel and documents showing that the planes in question actually belonged to the Israeli government. Ben-Menashe became talkative when he left prison. He claimed to have been personally involved in billion-dollar weapons deals between Iran and Israel. I remember this. Think about that. Iran and Israel had billion-dollar weapons deals. If I recall correctly, it was around the time that I think we were highly instrumental in instigating or at least prolonging the Iran-Iraq war, which was a horrible, horrible war. And I believe we armed both sides or maybe facilitated somehow, but Israel was arming Iran during that time, if I recall correctly. Okay. He claimed Yes, it was part of the latter's plan to exacerbate Iran-Iraq tensions. So Israel wanted to exacerbate Iran-Iraq tensions. So did we, I think. He verified Riconosciuto's assertions that Promise had been sold to foreign intelligence agencies and traded through back channels that developed over the October surprise and Iran-Contra operations, and that Earl Bryan had been involved. I'm sorry, I have to do this right now. I have to see how much this Robert Maxwell book costs, because I have a feeling if it gets too down the rabbit hole with the Israel stuff, it's going to be prohibitively expensive. Let's just see. Okay, this is Robert Israel Super Spy. Here it is. Okay, $32. $32. I'm going to show you because it's just fun to watch. To watch AI shill for the state. There you go. 32 clams. Nice. Okay. Let us continue. He verified Riconosciuto's assertions that Promise had been sold to foreign intelligence agencies and traded through back channels that developed over the October surprise and Iran-Contra operations, and that Earl Bryan had been involved. See, that's interesting. That's the thing I was talking about yesterday on the newsreel, that Steve Bannon was part of the team that was supposed to get the hostages out of Iran in time for the election between Carter and Reagan, and that mission failed. That was I believe that was the October surprise, but it was around that. That was the subject of the October surprise that got Reagan elected over Carter. And it did later come out, but I'm pretty sure that was like 100% George H.W. Bush's doings. But yeah, these guys, man, it's deep. As a special intelligence consultant to the Israeli prime minister in 1989, Ben Menashe maintained that a Chilean arms manufacturer told him that he had been a go-between in Bryan's deal to sell Promise to Iraqi intelligence. Wow, 2 years prior to that, according to Ben Menashe, he attended a meeting in Tel Aviv where Bryan claimed that the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and the Defense Intelligence Agency all used Promise and then gave the software to Israeli intelligence. That was early on. Okay. Even with this independent corroboration, Earl Bryan continued to deny any connection with Riconosciuto and Ari Ben-Menashe. He insisted that he had only read about Inslaw in the papers, although the company's founders continued to insist that Bryan's company had tried to acquire it in 1983. Then Richard Babayan, an Iranian arms dealer in prison awaiting trial on securities fraud, corroborated Ben Menashe's statements, connecting Bryan to the sale of the software to Iraq and South Korea. In an affidavit dated March 22nd, 1991, Babayan swore, I, Richard H. Babayan, being duly sworn, do hereby state as follows. During the past several years, I have acted as a broker of sales of materials and equipment used by foreign governments in their armed forces, intelligence, and security organizations. In the capacity described in paragraph 1, I attended a meeting in Baghdad, Iraq, in October or November 1987 with Mr. Abu Muhammad of Intezamat, an intelligence and security organ of the government of Iraq. Mr. Abu Muhammad is a senior-ranking official of Intezamat and a person with whom I had extensive dealings over the previous 3 years. During the aforementioned meeting with Mr. Abu Muhammad, I was informed that Dr. Earl W. Bryan of the United States had recently completed a sale presentation to the government of Iraq regarding the Promise computer software. Furthermore, it is my understanding that others present at Dr. Bryan's Promise sales presentation were General Richard Secord of the United States and Mr. Abu Muhammad. In early to mid 1988, I mean, this is why this guy got killed, presumably, Danny Casolaro. In early to mid 1988, in the course of subsequent visits to Baghdad, Iraq, I was informed that Dr. Earl W. Bryan had in fact provided the promised computer software to the government of Iraq through a transaction that took place under the umbrella of Mr. Sarkis Saganolan, an individual who has had extensive business dealings with the government of Iraq since the late 70s in the fields of military hardware and software. I was also informed that the government of Iraq acquired the promised software for use primarily in intelligence services and secondarily in police and law enforcement agencies. During the course of the visits described in paragraph number 4, I also learned from Mr. Abu Muhammad that the government of Libya had acquired the promised computer software prior to its acquisition by the government of Iraq. That the government of Libya, this thing would be worth billions of dollars. That the government of Libya had by then made extensive use of Promise, and that the government of Libya was highly recommending the Promise software to other countries. I was informed that the high quality of the reference for the Promise software from the government of Libya was one of the principal reasons for the decision of the government of Iraq to acquire Promise. In the capacity described in paragraph 1, I attended a meeting in early 1988 in Singapore with Mr. Y.H. Nam of the Korea Development Corporation. The Korea Development Corporation is known to be a cutout for the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. So let's just think about this. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I assume the U.S. government did, and I have read that the Israeli government put a back door in this stuff. So not only are they making money selling this to everybody on Earth, but they're getting everybody on Earth to do all this sleuthing, to collect all this information, and then they're going around the back door to look at it themselves. So that is quite a surveillance operation. And this is like 1990. This must have been these guys' lucky day when they saw this promised software, and they couldn't have this person who I think, from what I could tell, has integrity. They couldn't have Hamilton, own it. I don't think he even wanted to make it military intelligence. He certainly didn't intend to make it international military intelligence tool with a back door in it, for sure not. In the capacity described in paragraph 1, I attended a meeting in Santiago, Chile in December 1988 with Mr. Carlos Cardoen of Cardoen Industries. During this meeting, I was informed by Mr. Cardoen that Dr. Earl W. Bryan of the United States and Mr. Robert Gates, he's been in the news. I think he had something to do with the Trump administration. They trotted out a few of these classic actors. He was a senior American intelligence and national security official and had just completed a meeting in Santiago, Chile with Mr. Carlos Cardoen. I hereby certify that the facts set forth in this affidavit are true and correct to the best of my knowledge. Further, affiant saith not. Richard Babayan. There's a lot of stuff that's sworn to by witnesses. Further corroboration for the illegal sale of Promise would come from the former agent of the United States Defense Intelligence Agency, Lester Knox Coleman III. In Trail of the Octopus, which I believe I ordered but have not yet received. In Trail of the Octopus, an examination of his work in the DIA, Coleman, I'm curious to know what year that was, because I believe Casolaro coined the phrase octopus. So I presume it would be after. An examination of his work in the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, Coleman claimed that as a surveillance consultant to the Cypriot Police Force Narcotics Squad, man, this is everywhere, CPFNS, he witnessed CPFNS officers unpacking software from boxes marked Promise Limited, Toronto, Canada. So they started out in Toronto and they maybe used that as a, like a mask for use in the police agency's recently centralized database. Although it seemed unlikely that such secret dealings would be so trumpeted, the story supported Riconosciuto's allegations that Earl Bryan had sold it to the Canadians. According to Coleman, and were they reselling it or were they a pass-through? Man, these frigging guys. According to Coleman, the database had been installed by Link Systems Limited, described by Coleman as a U.S. government cutout established to fulfill a contract with the United Nations Fund for Drug Abuse Control. Further, well, I guess, I mean, that would be their excuse for it. Further investigation by Coleman revealed that these were bootleg copies of Promise made without the knowledge of Inslaw, to which a backdoor software routine had been added. So they say, this is the thing, this is me talking, sorry. I should make it clear. They use, one of the excuses they use for violating our rights, especially surveillance and civil rights, all that kind of stuff, is the drug war, which of course they promote. Who is they? Well, this book, another reporter who was suicided, Gary Webb, wrote Dark Alliance about the CIA bringing crack into this country. Freeway Ricky Ross, you can find interviews with him. He was the guy who was on the ground in LA distributing that stuff. So they create the drug war and then they use it to take away our rights. It's really awful. Terrorism, same thing. Environmental pollution too, I'm sure. And I'm not talking about carbon dioxide, which is the gas of life. I'm talking about the actual pollution that they don't pay attention to, that Greta never talks about. Alrighty. Yeah. Back door had been added. No matter how securely the front door might be barred with entry codes and passwords, American operators holding the key to the secret back door could break into Promise systems operated by Cyprus, Egypt, Syria, Pakistan, Turkey, Kuwait, Israel, Jordan, Iran, and Iraq whenever they wished, access the data stored there, and get out again without arousing the slightest suspicion that the security of those systems had been breached. But they couldn't get into the San Bernardino perp's phone. Really? Okay. In 1992, Ari Ben Menashe published a memoir of his career in international arms trading called Prophets of War. Yeah, I guess I had read ahead. Prophets of War right here. In it, he explained his understanding of William Hamilton's NSA background in establishing spy posts against the North in Vietnam. So I guess he had been around for a while, Bill Hamilton. Where he computerized a Vietnamese English dictionary and began developing early versions of Promise, according to Ben Menashe. I have a book called Surveillance Valley that says that the total surveillance state began, the computers for that began, the first kind of use of that kind of thing was Vietnam. Surveillance Valley, I have it somewhere here. I think it is written by an Israeli guy, if I'm not mistaken. Interesting. He computerized a Vietnamese English dictionary and began developing early versions of Promise, according to Ben Menashe. The program he was developing would have the ability to track the movements of vast numbers of people around the world. Dissidents or citizens who needed to be kept under watch would be hard put to move freely again without Big Brother keeping an eye on their activities. Elaborating on his sworn statement, Ben Menashe explained that some officials working for the Reagan administration had hoped to use the Israelis to sell Promise to intelligence and police agencies throughout the world. Okay, so they were using the Israelis. Ben Menashe quoted Rafi Eitan, the anti-terrorism advisor to the Israeli PM mentioned in the affidavit, as saying, "We can use this program to stamp out terrorism by keeping track of everyone." But not only that, we can find out what our enemies know too. Wow. You could tell if you're like counter information, and that is, talk about one step ahead. Wow. So you could even sell it to someone as say that we're friends, let's bury the hatchet, Libya, whatever. And no, Iraq, Iran, these are not people who were friends after this. Ben Menashe also gave some description of how he envisioned the Promise software might work. Using a modem, the spy network would then tap into the computers of such services as the telephone company, the water board, other utility commissions, credit card companies, etc. Promise would then search for specific information. For example, if a person suddenly started using more water and more electricity and making more phone calls than usual, it might be suspected that he had guests staying with him. Promise would then start searching for the records of his friends and associates, and if it was found that one had stopped using electricity and water, it might be assumed, based on other records stored in Promise, that the missing person was staying with the subject of the investigation. Your phone can do stuff like that too. Like the algorithm of your GPS coordinates, which it's keeping a log of, whether you enable it or not, it's keeping the log. Whether you can see it or not is your business. But that can be trigger this guy's having an affair thing. If you go to a residential place at lunchtime that isn't your home, that's probably going to be like, you could flag that. And the way they get away with spying on Americans without a warrant is they say, if you have any connection to a foreigner, we get to spy on you. They can do the back door and find some connection and then use that to justify without saying that they had that back door. They can say, well, we noticed this and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it's certainly obvious how this would be, could violate your rights. This would be enough to have that person watched. Ben-Menashe also detailed Promise's notorious backdoor, which allowed Israeli access via modem-encoded passwords to the files of any foreign intelligence service using Promise. And they charged people for it. That's their genius. Like Google and the CIA and stuff, we pay. They're for-profit businesses, and they use the money to spy on us. Funny. Samson, no barking. Stop barking. Details about how Promise works, why it made such a prize for Earl Bryan, were and remain sparse and vague. In a newsletter produced as part of a database on intelligence literature and personalities called Namebase, author Daniel Brandt argues that Ben-Menashe's chapter on Promise compromised an otherwise frequently believable book and should have been deleted. What? Details about how it works. A newsletter produced as part of a database on intelligence literature and personalities called Namebase. The author argues that Ben-Menashe's chapter on Promise compromised. Okay, so he's saying that the chapter in this book that was dedicated to Promise, which Daniel Brandt is saying is not true, makes it clear that Ben-Menashe is a liar. But other people corroborate those details about Promise, or certainly enough ancillary details that it supports his view. And Daniel Brandt does not seem to be offering evidence that it is untrue. Brandt states that a backdoor to get around password protection is easy for any programmer, and it explained why the intelligence community might be interested in peddling it to foreign governments. Please note, however, this is Brandt, please note, however, that you still need physical access to the computer, either through a direct connect terminal or a remote terminal through the phone lines, in order to utilize a backdoor. Ari Ben-Menashe wants us to believe that foreigners allow technicians from another country to install new computer systems in the heart of their intelligence establishments and don't even think to secure physical access to the system before they start entering their precious data. What do you think about that? You think you have to physically put a bug in there? Aren't these things over phone lines anyway? Can't you just tap the phone lines? I mean, I don't know how it works, but I'm not buying Brandt's logical fallacy here, that he's claiming there's logical mistake. Then Brandt goes on to say, Ben-Menashe claims that Promise can suck in every other database on Earth, such as those used by utility companies, and correlate everything automatically. I don't like to see whistleblowers like Ben-Menashe needlessly discredited by their own high-tech gullibility. Now, we know that absolutely all of this is completely possible and utilized now. Like, that's nothing. And those guys were way ahead of us of what we knew. I know nothing about tech in any kind of technical sense, but this is, I know they can do it through an electrical plug, from what I understand. One person who Brandt's finished. Now we go back to the book. One person who might have had a view of how Promise works was Charles Hayes. Newspapers identified Hayes as a salvage dealer in Pulaski County, Kentucky, near the temporary home of Ari Ben-Menashe in Lexington, who purchased $45 worth of surplus computer equipment from the government in July 1990. The equipment included 13 terminals, 9 printers, 2 cartridge module drives, 19 backup cartridges, and 2 central memory units, equipment that had been used by the U.S. Attorney's Office since 1983 to maintain information via promise on the Witness Protection Program, informants, office employees, and outstanding grand jury cases. Holy cow. I mean, that would be very dangerous if gotten into the, hands of the mob. In August, when federal officials discovered that a weak magnetic screwdriver had failed to purge this information from the equipment adequately, 2 FBI agents dispatched to make inquiries of Hayes were kicked out. 3 days later, Hayes began to cooperate with the U.S. Attorney's Office, denied that he had possession of any information that might have been on the equipment, and invited an inspection. Inspectors discovered that the serial numbers of the 2 cartridge modules that Hayes claimed were the ones he bought did not match the numbers of the modules the Justice Department had sold. Hayes then claimed he had sold the modules but did not name the purchasers until federal officials filed a lawsuit. Justice Department attorneys later claimed that Hayes had indeed tried to sell the secret information to an undercover informant, but criminal charges were never filed. So Justice Department attorneys claimed that Hayes had tried to sell the secret information to an undercover informant. So sounds like the DOJ just went behind the scenes to try to buy them back from these guys after stupidly selling them without fully erasing them. The case led to a congressional investigation of computer security. The Justice Department now tosses rather than sells its extra data storage devices. They probably keep them and sell them on the side. Even Bill Hamilton did not have a firm grasp on the workings of the full modified promise system. In a 1992 interview, he maintained that it could run on any Unix machine, Hewlett-Packard Unix, RISC 6000, AT&T, AS400, under its own operating system and on mainframes under MVS, that it was comprised of 88 program modules, and that the source code, replete with the INSLAW name throughout the code commentary, was kept by any government that had it. I guess he's saying there's a trail. When asked how a foreign country could modify the source code without discovering the back door, Hamilton was cryptic. I don't know what's meant by the back door. What we've been told is that not only the software was sold, but computers with extra chips. What the chips do, we've been told, the extra chips, is to broadcast the data inside Promise to satellites owned by the NSA. Well, that explains why you would not need a physical connection. But we don't know enough about it as they've never shared anything with us. Maybe they said the software only works with the hardware and they sold the hardware with it. And it had these transmitters in it. This possibility, this is a 1992 interview. This possibility neatly bypasses objections that physical access is required for a backdoor to work. Ari Ben-Menashe claimed that Earl Bryan's company Hadron sold Promise to Jordan as a test for the backdoor. Hadron technicians installed Promise for Jordanian intelligence in Amman, connecting it also to the computers of the city's public utilities. Yeah. If you're going to buy it and they have to install it, you don't know. This is in the 80s. IBM sold to Jordan in the late 1970s. From a small apartment in Amman, a Mossad-connected importer-exporter used Promise to find out everything about everybody, as well as to tap into Jordan's military secrets, downloading it all to disks and passing it on to his contacts whenever he left the country. Okay, so that was 40 years ago. I think we can safely assume that it's more comprehensive now than it was then. With the help of Wackenhut and the Cabazons, according to Ben-Menashe, the U.S. developed its own version of the backdoor, and the U.S. and Israel began looking for a neutral company through which it could sell the program to foreign intelligence services. The company chosen for the task was Degem, a computer firm with offices in Israel, Guatemala, and the South African Bantustan homeland. It had been taken over for the purpose, maybe the South African Bantustan homeland is kind of like our Cabazon Indian Reservation and free from any kind of federal regulations. It had been taken over for the purpose by Robert Maxwell, the publishing mogul who drowned under mysterious circumstances in 1991, allegedly drowned. Through Maxwell's Degem, working in tandem with Bryan's Hadron, the software found a home with the military regime in Guatemala where it tracked leftist insurgents. Even if they traveled under a false name, various characteristics such as height, hair color, age were fed into roadside terminals, and Promise searched through its database looking for a common denominator. It would be able to tell an army commander that a certain dissident who was in the north 3 days before had caught a train, then a bus, stayed at a friend's house, and was now on the road under a different name. That's how frightening the system was. According to Ben Menashe, Promise was used in South Africa to track and squelch the organizers of a strike among the black coal miners via their mandatory identity cards. DeGem also sold Promise to the Soviet Union, and the system was utilized by its GRU intelligence service at least until the coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. So this would make you think. I remember Uncle Ted said, pretty soon, in the 2000 somethings, surveillance is going to be too perfect for you to really be able to mount effective resistance. So we better move now. It looks like any kind of effective revolutionary action, unless it defeats this stuff, which goes hand in hand with my idea that it's mercenaries and not Boogaloo Boys who could actually do a coup, it's not going to get anywhere. And I mean, a lot of these revolutions are communist. I really, I don't understand the Latin American countries always go for that. My guess is Jeremy Kuzmarov understands it. But regardless, you might have a revolution that doesn't just want to institute communism, but wants to restore our constitution. It probably is not going to get off the ground unless you defeat this stuff, which means it would have to be insiders, which means you would never be able to trust them. I don't know. The possibilities this opens up are quite enlightening. All right. Ben Menashe had one more footnote to add to the Promise story in his memoir. He claimed that because of Inslaw, an attorney, Lee Ratner of the Washington law firm Dickstein and Shapiro, was forced into early retirement in an agreement that forbade him to practice law for 5 years. This happened shortly after Ratner began representing Inslaw for the firm. According to Ben Menashe, this also happened after Dickstein and Shapiro received a $600,000 transfer from a CIA Israeli slush fund for the purpose of getting Ratner off the case via Earl Bryan. Ben Menashe claimed this. I don't know how he knew it, so let's look at the footnote, which is footnote. What? It's footnote 23, and there's only 22 footnotes? Weird. Crappin' weird. Although, I mean, it says that it's in here. So I will look at that. I think it's probably page 141, which was the source of the previous footnotes. Wow. Okay. So I'm going to wrap it up. But first, I guess we're starting a new section because there's like this interim page. I will read this, and then I will leave it at that. The body of Alfred. Oh, maybe I'll do some comments if a couple people want to say something. The body of Alfred Alvarez, shot in the head with a .38 caliber bullet, burned in the desert heat for a day. It sat in a wooden chair behind Alvarez's house in a yard on Bob Hope Drive in Rancho Mirage, located in Riverside County. Police discovered the body along with those of 2 others, friends of Alvarez. 6 months later, police broke open a door to a condo on Kearney Street and discovered the dead body of Paul Maraska, hog-tied by a telephone cord noosed around his neck and his curled legs. Maraska had strangled slowly as his legs uncurled. 3 days later, Mary Quick, a 63-year-old schoolteacher and head of the Women's Auxiliary of American Legion Post 509 in Fresno, was killed by a shot to the head as she approached the Legion Hall. Investigators came to believe that all 3 murders were connected. Well, that sets us up for a very interesting part 3 of The Octopus, Secret Government, and the Death of Danny Casolaro, our discussion of this book by Kenn Thomas and Jim Keith. So let me just see if you've got any comments that you wanted to share. See, I'm sacrificing this $1,000 book for this purpose. I'm cracking the spine. You're really not supposed to do that. Okay. Hi, Stuart. Hi, Renee. Burning Beard says all forms of weapons were being tested at Cabazon, if you can believe Michael Riconosciuto. I do. Juan says, like I was saying earlier, that, I don't really blame, like, I guess I was thinking of Chappelle. Like, he quit. He was like, "I'll just go back to stand up. I don't wanna play your game." But they don't let you do that. So, that's your life. Do you go and, like, make less good jokes? I don't know. Yeah, I respect you, Juan. Definitely quit if it's something that shocks the conscience. I mean, if you're supposed to do something immoral, absolutely positively quit. But, uh I just don't know. Like, I think about Ron Paul. Was he supposed to say 9/11 was an inside job and lose any connection to a mainstream America that might want to restore the Bill of Rights? Honestly, you know what? Like, let's actually, maybe you want, if you're still here, Juan, answer that question. I agree with Juan, Stewart says. Oh, Burning Beard is talking about the Surveillance Valley book. It's by Yasha Levine. Yes, it is a great book. I don't know what frightening me is talking about. If you could explain frightening me. I heard he had a semi truck with a system moving around Kentucky hacking satellites. Burning Beard says, I do too, probably saying to agree with that. Anyway, well, I do really enjoy the conversation. So thank you for all for coming live. I really appreciate that. Thank you all for who's listening on the podcast. If you want to listen to the first one, go back to June 20th, 2024. And hopefully I'll do the next one in a week or two. It's a small book, but man, does it pack some punch. This is Monica Perez. And if you want to do it without commercials, there's a premium feed on iTunes for less than $5 a month. Later.